The first thing you need to understand is that I wasn't just in love with Elizabeth. I was devoted to her. For 30 years, she wasn't just my wife. She was my partner, my confidant, the anchor in a life that was often chaotic. When I first met her, I thought she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. Auburn hair cascading over her shoulders, eyes that sparkled with mischief and curiosity, and a laugh that could cut through even the darkest mood. We were young and broke when we got married. Our first apartment had cockroaches and a heater that barely worked, but we didn't care. We were too busy building dreams together. I worked 2 jobs to get us by while she studied to finish her degree. She'd bring me late-night coffee, sit with me in silence as I pored over case files, and tell me how proud she was of the life we were creating. Time passed and our lives grew fuller, careers, kids, a mortgage. The small, messy apartment gave way to a sprawling house in the suburbs, complete with a white picket fence and a garden she tended to religiously. I rose through the ranks at my firm, and she made our house a home. We laughed, we fought, we made up. It wasn't always easy, but I believed we were solid, unshakable. The idea of betrayal? It wasn't even in the realm of possibility. Elizabeth wasn't just my wife. She was the mother of my children, the woman who held my hand when my father died, who stayed up all night with me when I had my first panic attack after a bad quarter at work. She was my foundation. When our 30th anniversary approached, I wanted to make it special. I booked a table at Verita, the restaurant where we celebrated our 10th anniversary. She loved that place. Its warm ambience, the way the chef personalized the menu. I even ordered a bottle of Chateau Margaux, her favorite wine, and had a sapphire necklace wrapped in velvet waiting for her at home. That night, she looked stunning in a navy blue dress that hugged her figure just right. Her hair was styled perfectly, and she wore a perfume I hadn't smelled in years, something floral and nostalgic. She smiled at me across the table, her hand reaching for mine. "You've outdone yourself as always," she said, her voice warm and affectionate. "Only the best for you," I replied. And I meant it. We spent the evening reminiscing. She told stories about the kids when they were younger, how our daughter once painted the family dog pink with nail polish. I laughed, remembering how Elizabeth had been furious at the time but couldn't stop herself from snapping a photo. We talked about the early years, how we scrimped and saved for our first family vacation. By the time dessert arrived, I felt a warmth that only decades of shared history could bring. But then something shifted. As the waiter cleared our plates, Elizabeth's demeanor changed. She grew quieter, her gaze dropping to the half-empty glass of wine in front of her. For a moment, I thought she might be unwell. "You okay?" I asked, leaning closer. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I've just been thinking about something." "Thinking about what?" She hesitated again, swirling her wine as if the answer lay somewhere in its deep red depths. When she finally spoke, her words came out measured, deliberate, as if rehearsed. "I want to talk about opening up our marriage." The restaurant suddenly felt too quiet, as if the soft murmur of other diners and the clinking of glasses had ceased entirely. For a second, I wondered if I'd misheard her. "What?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. I've been feeling like there's something missing," she continued, her voice low. "It's not about you. You're an amazing husband. But I think this could be a way for us to grow, to explore." "Explore?" I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to make her flinch. She looked at me, her expression a mix of hope and apprehension. "Yes, together, could make us stronger, closer even." My hands clenched into fists under the table. The woman who had vowed to love, honor, and cherish me was now suggesting that our marriage wasn't enough for her. 30 years of fidelity, of sacrifice, of building a life together, and this is what she wanted? "Why would you even say that?" I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been reading about it," she said quickly. "Talking to people. It's not as unusual as you might think, and for some couples it really works. I'm not saying I don't love you. I do. But stop," I said, cutting her off. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow. "Just stop." The waiter approached then, oblivious to the storm brewing at our table, and asked if we'd like coffee or dessert. I shook my head, unable to even look at him. Elizabeth smiled politely and said, "No, thank you. Just the check." The drive home was silent. She tried to take my hand once, but I pulled away, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. When we got inside, I turned to her, the words boiling inside me finally spilling out. "Let me make something very clear," I said, my voice trembling with restrained anger. "If I ever find out you've been unfaithful, if you so much as entertain the idea of being with someone else, you will regret it. Do you understand me?" She stared at me, her face pale. For a moment, I thought she might cry, but instead, she just nodded. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I didn't respond. Couldn't. I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her standing alone in the hallway. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I replayed her words over and over in my mind. I've been feeling like there's something missing. What the hell did that mean? And why did it feel like she was already gone? I woke the next morning to the sound of Elizabeth moving around in the kitchen. She was humming softly, her voice carrying through the house like nothing had happened. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands, still clenched from the night before. My head was pounding, a dull ache that refused to fade. When I finally made my way downstairs, she greeted me with a bright smile. "Good morning. I made your favorite, pancakes and bacon." The smell of maple syrup filled the air, but it didn't comfort me the way it usually did. Her smile felt off, too cheerful, too practiced. I sat down at the table, watching her move around the kitchen like a performer on stage. "How'd you sleep?" she asked, setting a plate in front of me. "Fine," I lied. "Good." She sat down across from me, her hands folded neatly on the table. "About last night," I stiffened, my fork hovering in midair. "What about it?" "I'm sorry if I upset you. I shouldn't have brought it up like that." She paused, her eyes searching mine. "I just wanted to have an honest conversation. That's all." "An honest conversation," I repeated, my voice flat. "About you wanting to sleep with other people." "That's not what I said," she replied quickly, her tone defensive. "It's what you meant," I shot back, the words coming out sharper than I intended. Her face fell, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the way she'd looked at me last night, the way she'd so casually suggested dismantling everything we'd built together. "I don't want to fight," she said softly. "I just want us to be happy." Happy. The word hung in the air like a cruel joke. The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling. Elizabeth seemed determined to act as though nothing had changed, throwing herself into her daily routines with almost manic energy. She hosted book club meetings, volunteered at the community center, and spent hours tending to her garden. But I wasn't blind. She was distant, her laughter forced, her touches fleeting. At night, she'd climb into bed beside me and turn her back, scrolling through her phone until she fell asleep. I started noticing little things. The way she kept her phone screen tilted away from me, the sudden influx of new friends whose names I didn't recognize, the errands that seemed to take longer than they should. One night, as she showered, I picked up her phone. It was locked, of course, a simple precaution, but one that felt like a wall between us. She'd never had a password before. Curious. Her voice startled me, and I turned to see her standing in the doorway, a towel wrapped around her. "Just checking the time," I lied, setting the phone down. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You could have just asked." As she walked past me, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Something wasn't right, and deep down I knew it. My suspicions began to consume me. I started paying closer attention, watching her carefully when she thought I wasn't looking. One afternoon, I noticed her leaving the house dressed more formally than usual. Black heels, a fitted dress, makeup that seemed just a bit too perfect for a simple errand. "Where are you headed?" I asked, leaning against the doorway. "Oh, just meeting the girls for lunch," she replied breezily. "Which girls?" She hesitated just for a fraction of a second. "Cynthia and Marie. You don't know them." I nodded, pretending to accept her answer. But as I watched her drive away, I felt a gnawing certainty that she was lying. That night I couldn't sleep. The idea of her with someone else, Sharing the intimacy that was supposed to be ours was like a poison in my veins. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that I was imagining things, but the doubt wouldn't let go. One evening, I finally confronted her. "Elizabeth," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I need to know something. Are you seeing someone else?" Her reaction was immediate. Her face flushed, her eyes widening in surprise. "What? No. How could you even ask me that?" "Because something's changed," I replied, my chest tight. "You've changed, and I need to know why." She stared at me, her expression shifting between anger and hurt. "I can't believe you would accuse me of something like that," she said, her voice trembling. "Then tell me I'm wrong," I said quietly. "Look me in the eye and tell me there's no one else." "I don't have to justify myself to you," she snapped, turning away. Her words hit me like a slap, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. As she stormed upstairs, I sat alone in the living room, the weight of her silence crushing me. That was the moment I knew, whether or not she admitted it, something was deeply, irreparably broken. After that night, the air between us was thick with tension. Every glance, every word, every touch or lack thereof, felt like a move in a game I didn't know how to play. Elizabeth carried on with her life as if my suspicions were nothing more than baseless paranoia. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding just beneath the surface. I started keeping mental notes of her behavior, the late nights, the sudden flurry of phone calls she'd take in another room, the way she'd dismissively brush off my questions with a forced laugh or an impatient wave of her hand. It was as though the Elizabeth the first knew, the woman I'd loved for 3 decades, was slowly being replaced by someone I didn't recognize. One afternoon, I decided I couldn't sit in the dark any longer. I called her phone while she was out running one of her errands. "Hello." Her voice was cheerful, casual, but I could hear the faint noise of a crowded space in the background. Plates clinking, distant laughter. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone even. "Where are you?" "Oh, just picking up some things at the store," she replied without missing a beat. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that it made my stomach turn. I hung up shortly after, my mind racing. If she could lie so easily about something so simple, what else was she hiding? I started following her. It felt wrong, intrusive, but I couldn't ignore the pit in my stomach any longer. The first few times, she went exactly where she said she would, the grocery store, the dry cleaners, the community center. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that I was overreacting, that the problem wasn't her but me. But then came the Thursday afternoon that shattered any illusions I had left. She told me she was meeting Cynthia and Marie for lunch, as she'd done so many times before. I let her leave without a word, then waited a few minutes before grabbing my keys and following her car. I kept my distance, my heart pounding as I trailed her through town. She didn't drive to any of the usual places. Instead, she pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe on the edge of town. A place we'd never been together, a place that felt oddly intimate. I parked a block away and watched as she got out of the car. She wasn't alone. A man was waiting for her near the entrance, tall and clean-shaven, with an easy smile that made my blood boil. Elizabeth approached him with the kind of familiarity that left no room for doubt. She touched his arm, leaned in for a quick hug, and they disappeared inside together. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The world outside seemed to blur, the sounds of passing cars and chirping birds fading into a dull roar. When she came home that evening, her demeanor was as light and carefree as ever. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and said about making dinner like nothing had happened. I played along, my voice steady even as the weight of what I'd seen threatened to crush me. Over the next few days, I pieced together the fragments of her deceit. I found receipts in her purse from places she'd never mentioned, messages on her phone from Marie that were strangely cryptic. Each discovery was a dagger to the heart, a confirmation of the betrayal I'd feared but hadn't wanted to believe. One night, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at the framed photo of our family on the mantel. The kids were grown now, living their own lives, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface of their parents' marriage. How did we get here? I whispered to the empty room. The answer, of course, wasn't simple. It wasn't just one thing, one moment. It was 1,000 small cracks that had gone unnoticed until the foundation finally gave way. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to bear. I had spent my life trying to be the man Elizabeth deserved. Loyal, dependable, willing to sacrifice whatever was necessary to make her happy. And now, as I sat there in the dim light of our living room, I realized that none of it had been enough. The man at the cafe, who was he to her? A passing distraction? A replacement? The thought of her laughing with him, touching him, sharing parts of herself that had once been mine alone was unbearable. But more than the anger, more than the hurt, there was a gnawing sense of failure. What had I done wrong? What could I have done differently to keep her from slipping away? That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't going to let her lies destroy the life we'd built together. If she thought she could betray me and walk away unscathed, she was sorely mistaken. The night I decided to confront the truth, I felt something inside me shift. It was as if the man I'd been for 30 years, devoted husband, steady provider, unshakable rock, was being burned away, leaving only a raw, unrelenting anger in his place. Elizabeth came home late that evening, her hair slightly disheveled, the faint scent of perfume clinging to her skin. She had the same practiced smile she'd been wearing for weeks, the one that no longer fooled me. "Sorry, traffic was awful," she said casually, setting her purse on the counter. I didn't respond. Instead, I watched her, my eyes following her every move as she poured herself a glass of wine and sank into the couch with her phone. "What's new?" she asked, not even looking up. "Nothing," I replied, my voice steady. "Just thinking." "About what?" I hesitated, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her shift uncomfortably. "About us." She finally looked at me, her brow furrowing slightly. "What about us?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "I know, Elizabeth." Her reaction was subtle. A brief flicker of something in her eyes, a slight tightening of her jaw, but it was enough. "You know what?" she asked, her voice calm but guarded. "Don't," I said sharply, cutting her off before she could spin another lie. "I've seen you. I know about the cafe. About him." The room fell silent, the air heavy with the weight of my words. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said finally, but her voice wavered ever so slightly. "Stop lying to me," I snapped, my voice rising. "I followed you, Elizabeth. I saw you with him. You can't deny it." Her face paled, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But instead, she straightened her shoulders, her expression hardening. "Fine," she said, her tone cold. "You want the truth? Yes, I've been seeing someone. But it's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. "You've been sneaking around behind my back, lying to my face, and you want me to believe it's not what I think?" She sighed, setting her glass down. "I wasn't trying to hurt you, James. I needed something else. Something more." "More?" I echoed, my chest tightening. "More than 30 years of loyalty? More than a husband who gave you everything he had?" "It's not about you," she said, her voice rising. "It's about me. I've been feeling lost, disconnected. And he made me feel alive again." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, struggling to comprehend how the woman I'd loved for so long could say something so callous. "And what about me?" I asked quietly. "What about how this makes me feel?" She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "I never meant for you to find out," she said softly. The room fell silent again, the weight of her confession settling between us like a chasm. That night I couldn't sleep. Her words echoed in my mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. I needed something else. He made me feel alive again. I thought about the years I'd spent building a life for us, the sacrifices I'd made, the moments I'd missed with my kids because I was working late to ensure she had everything she wanted. And for what? So she could throw it all away for a fleeting sense of aliveness? But beneath the anger, There was something else, a gnawing sense of failure, of inadequacy. Had I been so focused on providing for her that I'd neglected to see her unhappiness? Had I been blind to the cracks in our marriage until it was too late? As the hours ticked by, I realized I couldn't stay in this limbo. I couldn't pretend everything was fine while she continued to betray me. If she wanted to walk away from our life together, she would have to face the consequences. The next morning, I made my decision. The morning after Elizabeth's confession, the world seemed sharper, harsher. The sunlight streaming through the windows felt blinding, the chirping of birds outside unbearably loud. Everything reminded me of the life we'd built together, now fractured beyond repair. Elizabeth moved through the house with the same calculated ease she'd adopted in recent weeks. She avoided my gaze, her movements efficient but devoid of warmth. It was clear she wasn't planning to address the previous night's confrontation unless I forced her to. I didn't. Instead, I observed her silently, studying her the way one might study a stranger. This wasn't the woman I'd married, the woman I'd built a life with. This was someone else entirely, someone I didn't trust. That afternoon, I sat in my car outside the cafe where I'd first seen her with the man. My mind raced as I considered my next move. I'd always prided myself on being a calm, rational man, but the rage bubbling beneath the surface made rationality feel like a distant memory. I knew I needed proof, something undeniable, something that would strip away the lies she clung to so desperately. If she wanted to destroy our marriage, I wasn't going to make it easy for her. After some research, I hired a private investigator. His name was Paul, a gruff, no-nonsense man who seemed to understand the gravity of my situation without needing an explanation. "You just need to know if she's cheating, or do you want details?" he asked, his tone neutral. "I want everything," I replied. "Everywhere she goes, everyone she meets, every message she sends. I need the truth, no matter how ugly it is." Paul nodded, sliding a contract across the desk. "You'll have it." Over the next week, I kept my distance from Elizabeth. I let her believe that I was retreating, licking my wounds, trying to process the revelation she'd so casually dropped on me. In truth, I was waiting for Paul to uncover the full scope of her betrayal. Each day, I checked my phone obsessively, my heart pounding whenever I saw a new message from him. At first, the updates were minor. Photos of her meeting the man at the cafe, receipts from a hotel on the outskirts of town. But as the days went on, the evidence became more damning. One evening, Paul sent me a recording, a snippet of a phone conversation between Elizabeth and the man. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "You've been saying that for weeks," the man replied, his tone light. "What's stopping you?" "It's not that simple," she said. "James, he's not a bad man. He doesn't deserve this." "Well, he deserves the truth, doesn't he?" The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my phone, my chest tight with a mix of anger and heartbreak. She knew what she was doing was wrong. She admitted it, and yet she continued. That night, I couldn't stop replaying the recording in my mind. The way she spoke about me, as though I were some distant, abstract figure rather than the man who had shared her life for 3 decades, was a new kind of pain. I poured myself a drink, the burn of the whiskey doing little to dull the ache in my chest. What had I done to deserve this? The question haunted me, but no answer came. As the hours dragged on, I realized that confronting Elizabeth again wouldn't be enough. Words wouldn't fix this. If she was determined to tear our marriage apart, I would make sure she faced the consequences. I didn't care about revenge, not in the way most people thought of it. What I wanted was justice. I wanted her to see the weight of what she'd done, to understand the depth of the pain she'd caused. And if that meant leaving her with nothing, then so be it. The plan began to form in my mind, each step more calculated than the last. By the time I went to bed, I knew exactly what I needed to do. The morning after solidifying my plan, I approached Elizabeth with a calmness that surprised even me. The rage still simmered beneath the surface, but I knew I couldn't let it show. Not yet. She was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone with the same detached expression she'd worn for weeks. She barely looked up when I entered, offering a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Morning," she said, her voice light. "Morning," I replied, taking a seat across from her. I sipped my coffee, studying her as she absent-mindedly stirred her own. For a moment, it felt almost normal. Two people starting their day together, sharing a quiet moment before the chaos of the world intruded. But the illusion was shattered by the memories of her betrayal, the images of her with him that Paul had sent me just the day before. I began, keeping my tone casual. "Maybe we should take a trip, just the two of us." She blinked, surprised. "A trip?" "Yeah," I said, leaning back in my chair. "It's been a while since we've had any time to ourselves. I thought it might be nice to get away, reconnect." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she quickly recovered. "That sounds nice, but things are pretty hectic right now. Maybe in a few weeks." I nodded, pretending to consider her words. "Sure, whenever you're ready." But I knew she wasn't ready, and she never would be. Over the next few days, I kept up the charade. I brought her flowers, cooked her favorite meals, even suggested we watch one of those romantic comedies she loved so much. Each gesture felt like a dagger to my own heart, but I forced myself to play the part. Elizabeth responded with hesitant warmth, as though she couldn't quite believe my sudden change in demeanor. I could see the doubt in her eyes, the way she studied me when she thought I wasn't looking. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, she reached for my hand. The gesture was so unexpected, so out of character for the Elizabeth I'd been living with these past weeks, that it took me a moment to respond. Her fingers were warm, soft against mine, but the touch felt hollow. "I've been thinking about us," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the screen. "Oh," I replied, my voice neutral. "I know things haven't been perfect lately, but I want to try. I want to make this work." Her words should have brought me relief, maybe even joy. Instead, they filled me with a deep, searing resentment. "Me too," I said, forcing a smile. But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I sat in my office, poring over the evidence Paul had gathered. The photos, the recordings, the detailed logs of her whereabouts. All of it painted a picture I could no longer ignore. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a calculated betrayal, one she'd chosen to continue despite knowing the pain it would cause me. I opened my laptop and began drafting the paperwork. Divorce, asset division, a plan to ensure she walked away with as little as possible. The anger that had been simmering for weeks now burned white-hot, fueling every keystroke. By the time I was finished, it was nearly dawn. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, my chest tight with a mix of triumph and despair. This was the beginning of the end. The morning after finalizing the divorce paperwork, I felt an eerie sense of calm. It was the kind of calm that follows a storm, the stillness before the real reckoning begins. Elizabeth moved through the house, unaware of the trap I was setting, and I marveled at how effortlessly she wore her mask. That day, I initiated the final phase of my plan. I called Paul to confirm the next steps, ensuring I had every piece of evidence necessary to leave no room for negotiation. "You've got enough to bury her," Paul said bluntly. "If she fights it, she won't stand a chance." "Good," I replied. "Make sure everything's ready. I want this to be airtight. Consider it done." That evening, I approached Elizabeth with what I hoped was a disarming smile. "Hey," I said, leaning against the doorway to the living room. "How about we go out for dinner tomorrow night? Somewhere nice?" She looked up from her book, surprise flickering across her face. "Dinner? Just us?" "Yeah," I said, stepping into the room. "It's been a while since we've had a proper date night. I thought it might be nice to get out of the house for a change." She hesitated, and for a moment, I wondered if she'd decline. But then she smiled, a hint of her old self shining through. "I'd like that." "Great," I said, my heart pounding. "I'll make the reservations." The next day was a whirlwind of preparation. I confirmed the reservation at a high-end restaurant downtown, one we'd celebrated countless anniversaries at in the past. It felt fitting, in a cruel sort of way, to mark the end of our marriage in the same place we'd once toasted to its longevity. When Elizabeth came downstairs that evening, dressed in an elegant black dress that hugged her figure in all the right places, I felt a pang of bittersweet nostalgia. She looked beautiful, radiant even, but the woman standing before me was no longer mine. "You look stunning," I said, offering her my arm. "Thank you," she replied, her smile genuine for the first time in weeks. As we drove to the restaurant, the tension between us seemed to dissipate, replaced by a fragile semblance of normalcy. We talked about mundane things, work, the kids, the weather, and for a moment I almost forgot the purpose of the evening. Almost. The restaurant was as exquisite as I remembered, its warm lighting and soft music creating an atmosphere of intimacy that belied the storm brewing beneath the surface. We were seated at a quiet table near the window, overlooking the city skyline. Elizabeth ordered her usual, a glass of red wine and the filet mignon, while I opted for scotch and the chef's special. As the evening progressed, I noticed her relaxing, the tension in her shoulders easing as she sipped her wine and laughed at my jokes. It was as though we were stepping back in time, reclaiming a piece of the life we'd lost. But then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and in that brief moment, the mask slipped. Her smile faltered, her eyes darting toward the phone before she quickly silenced it and placed it face down on the table. "Everything okay?" I asked, feigning concern. "Yeah," she said, her tone too casual. "Just work stuff." The lie was so obvious it almost made me laugh. I leaned back in my chair, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. "You know, Elizabeth, I've been thinking a lot about us lately." "Oh," she said, her voice tinged with caution. "I want us to work," I continued, my tone sincere. "I want to put the past behind us and move forward." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt. "I want that too," she said quietly. "Good," I said, setting my glass down. "Because I've made some decisions. Big ones." Her brow furrowed. "What kind of decisions?" I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope containing the divorce papers. I slid it across the table toward her, watching as her expression shifted from confusion to shock. What is this?" she stammered. "It's what you wanted," I said, my voice cold. "Freedom, independence, a fresh start." She opened the envelope with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the documents inside. "You're divorcing me?" "No," I said, leaning forward. "You divorced me the moment you chose him over us." Her face paled, her eyes filling with tears. "James, I can explain." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "Don't insult me by pretending there's an explanation that makes this okay. I gave you 30 years, Elizabeth. 30 years of loyalty, of sacrifice, of love. And this is how you repay me." Her tears spilled over, streaking her makeup. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she whispered. "But it did," I said, my tone unforgiving. "And now you'll have to live with the consequences." As we left the restaurant that night, the weight of finality hung heavy in the air. Elizabeth begged me to reconsider, her voice choked with sobs, but I didn't waver. By the time we reached the house, I knew there was no going back. The days that followed our dinner were a blur, an unending parade of phone calls from Elizabeth, each one more desperate than the last. First, I ignored her calls. She needed time to face what she'd done, to process the consequences of her actions. But when the voicemails started coming in, each one filled with apologies, pleas, and promises to change, I couldn't avoid them any longer. I listened to the first one in silence, her voice trembling with emotion. "James, please don't do this. I love you. I'm so sorry for everything. I made a huge mistake, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix it. Please, please just give me a chance to prove it to you." Her words cut through me like a knife, but I knew better than to be swayed by them. This wasn't about love anymore. This was about control, about her trying to salvage something that could never be salvaged. The second voicemail came the next day. "I don't know what happened to us, but we can fix it. I can fix it. Please, James, I don't want to lose you. Don't make me lose everything." By the third voicemail, her tone had changed. It was more frantic, more panicked. You can't just throw away everything we built. You can't just walk away from all those years. Don't do this to me, James. I won't survive it. You can't do this to me. I deleted them all one by one, without listening to the entire messages. They were the same empty words I had heard too many times before, and I wasn't falling for them again. One evening, nearly a week after the dinner, I returned home from work to find Elizabeth sitting on the front steps of the house. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes red and puffy from crying. I could feel the weight of her presence before I even saw her, an unbearable reminder of everything that had gone wrong. "James," she said quietly as I approached, "please just hear me out. I know you're angry, but I can't stand this silence between us. I need you to know how sorry I am. I've never meant to hurt you. I didn't realize how much I was destroying us until it was too late." I stopped in front of her, my arms crossed. "You're right about one thing. It is too late." Her face fell, and the tears started again. "Please don't say that. You don't understand. I was lost, James. I didn't know who I was anymore. But I know now. I know what I've done, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix it. I'll go to therapy. I'll quit seeing him. I'll do anything." I knelt down in front of her, locking eyes with her for the first time in days. "Elizabeth, you don't get it. This isn't about therapy. It's not about him. It's about what you did to me, to us. You can't just erase all the lies, all the deceit with a few words. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." Her lips trembled, but she didn't speak. The weight of my words seemed to settle in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that lingered after our brief confrontation. I had expected a sense of relief when I made the decision to divorce, but instead, I felt hollow, like I was floating through life without direction. There was no joy in winning this battle. There was only the aftermath of everything we'd lost. I found myself going through the motions, working, eating, sleeping, but I wasn't really living. It was like my soul had been torn in two, and nothing could fill the space that Elizabeth's betrayal had carved. In the quiet moments, I thought about our life together. The good times, the bad times, the small moments of happiness that we'd shared. And I wondered how it had come to this. How had I been so blind to her unhappiness? So caught up in my own routines that I failed to see the cracks in our marriage until it was too late. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much of my own identity had been tied to her. I had defined myself by our marriage, by our shared history. But now, with her gone, who was I? What did I have left? I threw myself into work to distract myself from the pain, but it didn't work. Every call, every meeting, felt like a hollow exercise. I missed her, and yet I hated myself for it. How could I miss someone who had destroyed everything we had built? How could I long for a woman who had betrayed me so completely? One evening, I was sitting at my desk, staring at the paperwork for the divorce, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Elizabeth. "Please, James, let's talk. I can't do this without you. I'll come to you. I'll do anything to fix this." I stared at the message for a long time, my mind a battlefield. Part of me wanted to give in, to let her back in, to believe that we could rebuild. But another part of me, the part that had been broken by her, knew that this was the final test. If I let her back in, I would never truly heal. I didn't reply. The following day, I woke up with a newfound clarity. I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about ending a marriage. This was about finding myself again, about reclaiming the life that I had allowed to slip away. I couldn't afford to keep holding on to the past, no matter how painful it was. I walked into the kitchen, where Elizabeth was sitting, her eyes swollen from crying. She looked up as I entered, her face a picture of vulnerability. "James," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm done, Elizabeth," I said quietly. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that things can go back to the way they were. You broke me, and I can't fix that." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let her speak. "I wish you well, but I have to move on. You should do the same." For the first time in weeks, I felt a weight lift from my chest. The pain was still there, but it wasn't as sharp. It was like I was finally learning to breathe again. I left the house that day with nothing but a small duffel bag. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't care. I just needed to escape. Elizabeth's tears, her words, they didn't matter anymore. The promises of change meant nothing to me now. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just numb. I rented a small apartment in the city. It wasn't much, but it was mine. There were no memories, no remnants of her. It was a blank slate, something I could start over with. At first, I found solace in the silence. The absence of her presence was overwhelming, but it was also liberating. I didn't have to worry about who she was texting or whether she was hiding something. I could breathe again. But after a few days, the emptiness began to gnaw at me. I hadn't realized how much of myself I had invested in our life together. Now I was alone with only my thoughts to keep me company. I threw myself into work even more, trying to fill the void. But there were nights when I couldn't escape it, when everything felt hollow, and I wondered if I had made the right choice. I wasn't sure if I was running from her or running from myself. It had been 2 weeks since I moved into the apartment, and things were starting to settle, albeit uneasily. I was beginning to adapt to the quiet, the absence of Elizabeth's voice echoing through the walls. I had almost convinced myself that I was fine, that I could live without her. That's when I saw her. It was a Thursday evening. I had just finished work and decided to stop by a local bar. I wasn't in the mood for company, but the idea of being surrounded by noise, even if it was strangers, seemed better than being alone with my thoughts. I walked in and made my way to the bar, ordering a drink. The place was dimly lit, with a few patrons scattered across the room. I didn't expect to see anyone I knew, but as I turned to find a seat, my eyes locked onto hers. Elizabeth. She was sitting at a small table in the corner, her head lowered, staring into her drink. She looked different, fragile, like someone who had been beaten down by the world. Her once perfectly manicured appearance was now disheveled, her eyes hollow. I stood there for a moment, frozen. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, to pretend I hadn't seen her. But my legs moved on their own. I approached the table slowly, unsure of what to say. She looked up at me, her face a mixture of surprise and something deeper. Guilt, maybe. "James," she whispered, as though she hadn't expected me to speak to her. I didn't respond at first. I just stood there, watching her, feeling the weight of everything that had happened between us. "I didn't think you'd ever want to see me again," she said quietly. "You're right," I replied, my voice flat. "But here we are." For a moment, neither of us spoke. She seemed lost in thought, and I couldn't bring myself to ask what she was doing here, or why she was alone. I didn't care about the answers anymore. "I've been thinking about you," she said finally, her voice strained. "I've been thinking about everything I did, and how stupid I was." "I don't want to hear it," I said, cutting her off. "There's nothing left for us to talk about." But her eyes, there was something in them that made me hesitate. For the first time since I left, I saw a flicker of the woman I had once loved. She wasn't the person who had betrayed me, but the one I had shared everything with. "I know you're angry," she said softly, "and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm not asking for that. I just wanted to see you one last time, to say I'm sorry, to tell you that I was wrong." I didn't know how to respond. My heart was caught between wanting to walk away and wanting to hear her say more. Anything that might bring closure to the nightmare that had consumed my life for months. But I didn't need closure. What I needed was peace. And I wasn't going to find it by listening to her apologies. "I think it's time for you to go," I said, turning away. And I walked out of the bar, not looking back. The next few days were marked by a silence I couldn't escape. I didn't hear from Elizabeth after our encounter at the bar, and part of me felt relief. I was done with her, done with the past. But another part of me, the part one was trying so desperately to bury, wondered if I had made the right choice. I didn't want to be that person, the one who second-guessed every decision. But the emptiness in the apartment, the absence of her laughter, her presence, it lingered in a way I hadn't anticipated. One evening, after another lonely dinner, my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number, but something in my gut told me who it was. I hesitated, staring at the screen for a long moment before answering. "James." Her voice was hoarse, broken. I could tell she'd been crying. "Elizabeth?" I said, keeping my tone cold, even though my insides were tight with something I couldn't name. I don't know what I expected," she whispered. After seeing you at the bar, I couldn't stop thinking about how I ruined everything. I didn't just lose you. I lost myself." I let the words hang in the air. There was no need to rush into a conversation I wasn't sure I was ready for. "I don't need to hear this," I finally said. "It's too late." Her voice wavered, desperate. "James, please. I've been to therapy. I'm working on myself. I know I hurt you, but I swear to you, I'm not the person I was. I've changed." I didn't believe her. Couldn't. I leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. The words she said sounded familiar, like the same ones she had used when she begged me for forgiveness before. Nothing about her felt genuine anymore. "Stop," I said, my voice firm. "You can't undo what you did. It's over." There was a long silence on the other end. For a moment, I thought she had hung up. But then she spoke again, her voice small. "I don't know how to move on without you, James." I didn't answer. Couldn't. Because I didn't know how to move on without her either. The days after that call passed in a blur, each one more restless than the last. I had convinced myself I was doing the right thing by walking away, by cutting ties with Elizabeth. But there were moments, quiet, fleeting moments, when I wasn't so sure. It was late one evening, around midnight, when the feeling hit me hardest. I had just finished reading a book I didn't care about, my mind wandering back to the days when Elizabeth and I would talk for hours about nothing, our words filling the empty spaces between us. The weight of that lost intimacy crashed over me again, and before I could stop myself, I reached for my phone. There it was, her name waiting in my messages. A simple text. "I miss you, James. I hope you're okay." I stared at it for what felt like hours. Part of me wanted to respond. Part of me wanted to reach out, to hear her voice again, to know that the woman I had once loved was still somewhere beneath the mess of what we had become. But I knew better. I deleted the message, and then I deleted the number. For a moment, the emptiness in the apartment seemed even louder. I felt like I was drowning in silence. The next few days, I found myself drifting through life like a ghost. I went to work, ate when I needed to, and spent my nights sitting in the dark. There was no excitement, no joy. It was just existence. I stopped answering calls from anyone. Friends, family, even Paul. I didn't want to hear from anyone. The last thing I needed was another person telling me what I should feel or what I should do. I wanted to be left alone. But then, as if by fate, Elizabeth showed up. I hadn't heard from her in days. Her voice was a distant echo in my mind. But when the knock on my door came, I felt my heart race. I opened it, and there she stood, fragile and small, looking like she hadn't slept in days. "James," she said quietly, her voice breaking. Please just listen to me." I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Elizabeth, standing on my doorstep, was the last thing I had expected. But there she was, eyes red from crying, her hands shaking slightly. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice trembling. "I know you think it's over, but I can't walk away like this. Not without trying to fix things." I leaned against the doorframe, trying to remain composed, but I could feel the old emotions stirring inside me, the ones I had spent so long burying. "Elizabeth, what do you want from me? What more is there to say?" Her eyes pleaded with me, and I could see the raw desperation in her face. "I don't expect you to forgive me, not yet. But I need you to understand. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was lost. I've been lost for so long." I didn't want to hear her excuses. Not anymore. She had made her choices, and I had lived with the consequences. "I can't just forget what you did, Elizabeth," I said quietly. "I can't just pretend it didn't happen. What you did to me, to us, it's not something that can be fixed by a few words or a few tears." She took a step closer, her voice soft but urgent. "I know, but I've changed, James. I've been working on myself. I've been seeing a therapist, and I'm starting to understand why I did what I did. I want to make things right. I shook my head. You don't get it. You had your chance to make things right, and you threw it away. She lowered her gaze, and for a long moment, there was only silence between us. I could hear the quiet hum of the city in the background, the steady rhythm of the world continuing on, unaffected by the storm inside my chest. I don't want to lose you, she whispered. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of her words. She didn't want to lose me, but she had already lost me the moment she made that choice. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, I said, my voice steady but final. But it's over. There's nothing left here to save. Her face crumpled, and for the first time since I left, I saw the raw pain in her eyes. But it wasn't my responsibility to fix her anymore. I wasn't the person I used to be, the one who could forgive everything and forget. With a final, heart-wrenching look, she turned and walked away. I watched her retreat into the darkness of the street, feeling a strange sense of both loss and relief. The days after Elizabeth left my apartment felt like a heavy fog had lifted. I had made the decision, and now I had to live with it. I knew it was the right thing to do, but the emptiness still crept in at the edges of my mind. I threw myself into work again, keeping my days as busy as possible. At least there, I could hide from the uncomfortable silence that lingered in my personal life. But even work couldn't numb the feelings that came in the quiet moments. It was one of those nights, sitting alone in my apartment after another long day, that I realized something. I hadn't truly started living again. I had been surviving, yes, but not living. I thought about the time before Elizabeth, the version of myself that existed before I became wrapped up in the idea of us. The man I used to be was independent, focused, full of ambition. I had lost sight of that man when I had let her into my life, when I had prioritized her happiness over my own. I knew now that I needed to find him again. The next day, I made a decision. I signed up for a hiking trip with a group of strangers. The idea was to step outside my comfort zone, to challenge myself. As I stood on the trail that first morning, looking out over the rugged landscape, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. The air was fresh, the world wide open. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, wasn't waiting for a phone call that would never come. I was just here, and it felt good. A few weeks later, I found myself standing at the edge of a cliff, staring out at the sunset. The colors in the sky were breathtaking, purples and pinks blending into the darkening horizon. I thought about everything that had happened, everything I had lost. But I also thought about what I had gained. The clarity, the freedom. I didn't need Elizabeth to define me anymore. I didn't need anyone but myself. I smiled as the wind blew through my hair. I had walked away from the past, and in doing so, I had found the person I had forgotten. A man who could stand alone, who could rebuild his life from the ground up. And I was going to be okay. It had been months since that final confrontation with Elizabeth. Time had blurred the sharp edges of the pain, but the lessons I had learned still stuck with me like scars on my soul. The emptiness I once feared had transformed into something more manageable, more bearable. I no longer saw it as a void to be filled, but a space where I could simply be. I had moved on, and it felt like I had stepped into a new life entirely. Work was going well, the hiking trips were now a regular part of my routine, and I had even started to reconnect with old friends. People who had been there before Elizabeth ever entered my world. There was a day, not long ago, when I found myself laughing over lunch with Paul. It felt strange at first, like I had forgotten how to enjoy the small things, but the more I allowed myself to, the more natural it became. I wasn't running from anything anymore. I was living, truly living. Yet, despite all of this progress, there were moments when I wondered about Elizabeth. I hadn't seen or heard from her since that day she left my apartment. Part of me hoped she had found what she was looking for, that she had truly changed. But another part of me couldn't shake the thought that we had both been broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. I ran into her once about 2 months ago. It was a fleeting encounter, just a passing glance in a crowded coffee shop. She didn't see me, but I saw her. She looked different, healthier, maybe even happier. But the sadness in her eyes was still there, lingering beneath the surface. I had to force myself to look away. It was strange, almost surreal, To realize that the woman I once loved was now nothing more than a memory, a person from a past life. The life I was building now didn't need her. It didn't need anyone, really. It was mine, and it was enough. I had learned that I didn't need to be defined by a relationship or the mistakes of the past. I was my own person. I could love, but I could also let go. And with that knowledge came a quiet peace. The kind that doesn't demand anything. It just exists. As I sat on my balcony one evening, the city lights flickering in the distance, I realized that my story wasn't over. It was just starting to unfold in ways I had never imagined. And for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful about the future. The journey had been painful, but it had shaped me into someone stronger, someone who had learned that sometimes the best way to move forward is to leave the past behind. Thank you for following this journey with me. It's been an intense ride, filled with heartbreak, confusion, and the long path toward healing. But it's not just my story. It's a story that so many of us share. If you've been through something similar, or if you've ever had to make the difficult choice to move on, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below and share your story. What would you have done in my shoes? Did I make the right choice? I want to hear from you. And if you found yourself moved by this journey, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps. And most importantly, if you want to hear more stories like this and be part of this community, make sure to subscribe. Thank you again for watching, and remember, you're not alone in your struggles. There's always a way forward.